Hello again. We're here with Michael Ventura, and we're continuing our conversation about Robert Bly. So, I think last time we stopped off by talking about his. We read his poem about Vietnam, and we were getting into Robert Bly and activism.
So, as I said last week, Bly was one of the early people organizing against the war in Vietnam. And I also spoke about his translations and how he was bringing from the likes of Pablo Neruda in Chile and Cesar Vallejo in Peru and a whole different approach to poetry. Thomas Tranströmer in Sweden that revitalized American poetry and revitalized American translation. There's much more translation available now than there was, say, in the 60s. There's much more interest in international poetry as opposed to just English language poetry, for which I'm very grateful because I only speak English, which makes me feel dumb sometimes. But when I met him in 1981, it would be, I'm pretty sure, or early 1982, that's when. He had just started something that called the men's movement, which I didn't know anything about when I met him. I was an editor, a senior editor. That doesn't mean the boss editor, it just means nobody told me what to do. I was a senior editor at LA Weekly, and I've been very interested in Robert Bly. I saw that he was coming to LA to do a reading at a church in Santa Monica, and I told Jay Levin, our editor, who didn't know who Robert Bly was, not a poetry guy, Jay Levin, and most people aren't, so that's not disparaging. And I pitched, look, let me interview this guy. If it's a good interview, let's put him on the cover. And Jay always liked it when I was enthusiastic about a subject, so he let me have my way. And I contacted the church. They gave me a number from Robert Bly, and Robert was on the phone. But, I was never intimidated. Not never. I was not intimidated to meet such people and do such interviews. The only two interviews that never intimidated me were gulp before going in was when I interviewed John Huston, great director of the Maltese Falcon and the Treacherous Sierra Madre, etc. And when I interviewed John Cassavetes, who was in many ways my hero. We talked about that some. But Robert Bly meant a great deal to me because my orientation as a writer was as a poet. I didn't know it when, and that's an unintentional rhyme, I didn't know it when I began writing that I'd be anything else. I dreamed of being a novelist. I never thought I would become a kind of journalist, a columnist, a commentator. But I didn't realize when I was in my teens and early 20s that actually the letters I was writing to my friends about the days before emails and the days before easily done and paid for comparatively long distance calls. Long distance call cost a lot of money back then. I didn't realize that when I'd write to my friends about movies, about plays, about books I was reading, that was really my rehearsal. Those years were really my rehearsal for writing columns. That's why my column was called Letters to 3 a.m. And so meeting a poet of Robert Bly's stature and his when I called, Robert had a very rasping, wasn't about rasping, but kind of, he said, well, have you read me? I'm going, yes. Have you read the book of interviews? Yes. Well, what's your paper called? It's LA Weekly. It's a pretty important paper in LA. Well, I heard it. Okay. Are you available for an interview? All right. I'll be at, he said he'd be at a place just north of LA on the coast that you'd know in a minute. Ojai. And there was a campgrounds or something on Ojai where people did conferences and stuff. We were just going to be there. And I could come at night. About 9 o'clock at night. And I'd never been there before. And I drive up my old Chevy, twisting roads, really dark, LA is just south, so there's glare up in the sky, but dark roads, and twisted all the way up a hill. And I asked somebody who's there, and they point me to a teepee. A freaking teepee. I go in, and here's this big man, because the guy was big. I don't mean fat, I mean he was a big Swede. And there's this big man sitting in a teepee where you can only stand in the middle. Michael! Okay. And I sit down, and I don't sit cross-legged very well. I don't sit on the ground very well. I never have. Never been comfortable with that. And we, I start asking him questions, and he sees I'm not a dope. He sees I really have read the stuff. I really have read his essays, especially his essay on leaping poetry. I've read several versions of it, where images leap from one to the other, where the psyche leaps with the images, where you're not just doing linear thought. And so he's interested all of a sudden. And we have this discussion. And during this discussion, he tells me about these men's conferences he's having. He's originated. He's done one in New Mexico. I think he did one in Minnesota. He was going to do one in California, up by the American River. And so I interviewed him partly about that. He had just published a book called, I have it right here, The Man in the Black Coat Turns. And he read me this poem. And I won't try to imitate Robert or Ruben, but he read me this poem. Those great sweeps of snow that suddenly stop 6 feet from the house. Now, Robert's saying that. Those great sweeps of snow that stop suddenly 6 feet from the house. Thoughts that go so far. Anyway. Those great sweeps of snow that stop suddenly 6 feet from the house. Thoughts that go so far. The boy gets out of high school and reads no more books. The son stops calling home. The mother puts down her rolling pin and makes no more bread. And the wife looks at her husband one night at a party and loves him no more. The energy leaves the wine, and the minister falls, leaving the church. It will not come closer. The one inside moves back, and the hands touch nothing and are safe. The father grieves for his son and will not leave the room where the coffin stands. He turns away from his wife, and she sleeps alone. And the sea lifts and falls all night. The moon goes on through the unattached heavens alone. The toe of the shoe pivots in the dust, and the man in the black coat turns and goes back down the hill. No one knows why he came or why he turned away and did not climb the hill. there thinking, this is a unique man. This is a man who has gone his own way. This is a man who has explored his own psyche. But this was also a man that night who was excited about these men's conferences, so he started talking about that. And for the end of the book he just published, and this is the last poem I'll read, but it sets it up. For the end of the book he just published, it was a recent poem called 50 Males Sitting Together. After a long walk in the woods, clear cut for lumber, lit up by a few young pines, I turn home, drawn to water. A coffin-like shadow softens half the lake, draws the shadow down the westward hills. It is a massive, masculine shadow, 50 males sitting together, in a hall or crowded room, lifting something indistinct up into the resonating night. Closer to me, out of shadow, the water lies lit, some of it pinkish from western clouds. Near shore, reeds stand about in groups unevenly, as if they might finally and at once ascend to the sky altogether. A thin thread of darkness lives in each reed, so it is relaxed, private. When the reed dies, it dies alone, as an animal does. Rooted, it waits only for itself. The woman stays in the kitchen and does not want to waste fuel by lighting a lamp, as she waits for the drunk husband to come home. Then, leaving the kitchen dark, she serves him food in silence. Nearly at my feet, motionless water lies calm, protected by reeds. So the son who lives protected by the mother lives protected by reeds in the joy of the half-darkness. These are thousands of years ago. He does not know what he should give, as herds slowly pass the cave mouth, what the world wants from him. Blood rises from dark neck holes, but how far he lives from working men. The blood asks, whose head has been cut off? The dark comes down slowly the way snow falls, or herds pass the cave. I look up at the other shore. It is night. Well, I got interested in all this. I was excited. Jay Levin really liked the interview. Then we put it on the cover. I wasn't aware at the time. And Jay, with his tongue-in-cheek way and kind of a way of goading me, which is all good fun in the newspaper business. The headline on the cover was, "Is this the smartest man in America?" Which embarrassed the hell out of me. That would never have been my headline. But what was. And the LA Weekly at the time was avant-garde as far as LA was concerned, and had a very good circulation by then. And this was the first time, and this is what I wasn't aware of at the time, this is the first time Robert Bly had been featured on the cover of a wide circulation, wide audience newspaper. Or magazine, whatever you want to call it. This was the first time.
Can you tell me?
Featured.
Can you tell me what was his? How popular was he at that time, and what circles was he known in? Besides poetry circles.
Besides poetry circles, he was not known.
Yeah.
There was the Vietnam thing. There was the prize he'd won, National Book Award. So he was known in poetry circles. Outside of poetry circles, Robert Bly was not yet named.
And as far as anti-war demonstrations, was he like a name in that, or was it just?
Well, you see, he wasn't young. I mean, he was younger.
Right.
The issue was, joined the Navy in World War II.
Yeah.
It was that generation.
Right.
And the people who were getting the headlines in the 60s were young. Don't trust anybody over 30.
Well, I'm thinking of like Father Berrigan type guys. I mean, there was.
No, he wasn't that either. His organization was called Poets Against the War.
Okay.
And I'm sure they worked with other people and demonstrated with them and coordinated with them and everything.
Yeah.
But he wasn't a national figure. No way. And this men's movement thing came out of left field. It was all his idea, and the reaction to it had barely started at this time. Like I say, it only had about 3 conferences, and so this was the first time he was on a wide circulation paper. He was being interviewed by a writer, myself, who at the time was one of the visible name writers in LA. And it packed the church. The church was packed. It couldn't have held any more people than cover story in the LA Weekly packed the church. Now, in the long run, I'm not sure I did Robert any favors. I need to say this about this man, though I admire him so much. Robert liked fame a little too much than was good for him. And I think fame bit him back after he'd been bitten by it. After he started getting to be a national name, I think he paid dues for that.
That's very interesting. So you were really like a catalyst for this next period of his life, and that era of his life. Then that next step, eh?
I've never thought of myself quite as a catalyst, but let's put it this way: I wasn't the catalyst, and Robert was his own catalyst in getting the idea for these men's movements.
Right.
He had already started a series of great goddess conferences that went on until he died. I mean, not until he died, but until he stopped functioning. It was called the Great Goddess Conference. It started in the mid-'70s or early '70s. It happened every year somewhere, and people were into it wasn't feminist per se, but the subject of it was that we don't just have in the roots of civilization, in the roots of Western civilization, we don't just have the male god. We have the great goddess. The earliest religious statues in the Mediterranean were of goddesses before Greece, well before Greece. You don't find any statues from that period of gods. And he was investigating from the mid-'70s the feminine in culture, because it had been so blotted out of culture. He would never have called himself, he wouldn't have labeled it anything. He never did. But he was looking to revitalize the feminine roots of Western civilization that had been lost. Now, this was concurrent with the women's liberation movement, as it was called in the late '60s and early '70s. When leaders of women's lib, like Ms. Magazine, which was very important and popular in the '70s among a certain class of people. We're talking about bourgeois culture. We're talking about almost exclusively white. We're talking about almost certainly educated. So we're, in that sense, it was a national movement and not a national movement.
You're talking about the men's conference.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Men's conference.
All right.
And in California. And a campsite by the American River up, I don't know, 50, 80 miles north and east of San Francisco. And they didn't, I brought a sleeping bag, but they didn't tell us we'd be sleeping outside. And it rained the whole time. Almost the entire time. So we were all sleeping, about 50 guys, in the biggest cabin, which was the hall, the kind of lecture hall where Bly would give the lectures. And head to toe, you got about 50 guys sleeping on the floor. It was awful. Food. It had apparently been no one's job to see that there was food and a cook. And it's raining and it's cold. It was March-ish because the Academy Awards were right around that time. And I left the camp to get a hotel room to watch the Academy Awards. Those are film critic after all.
What year was this?
God, I wish I could remember exactly.
Probably 80.
82.
82. Okay.
82, yeah. I hadn't met you guys yet.
Okay.
And with the food situation, everybody started getting sick, getting colds. And I found in the kitchen a great big, like those, what do they call them? It's not exactly a vat, but a great big
Colander?
jug of peanut butter.
Okay.
And there was white bread, and I found onions. And I ate peanut butter and onion sandwiches whenever I got hungry. I invented the peanut butter and onion sandwich as far as I was concerned. And I didn't get sick. My breath might not have been too good, but I didn't get sick. And in terms of the people who went, it was the people, the men and women, as Robert Bly and then with Michael Mead, deserves an enormous amount of credit for bringing a lot of those conferences down to earth. It was the people who went were roughly between 25 and 45, most of them. Some older, some younger, but not much. Mostly educated, mostly white. I can't remember if I ever saw a person of color there. And wanting to figure out how to be males in a time when the conception of male was changing. What did it mean to be a man anymore? What did tribal initiation do that our culture doesn't do? Now, once this started to get out, it got out slowly. The feminists, at least the Ms. Magazine feminists,
Yeah.
whom I respect a great deal, they went bananas on this thing.
Yeah.
Their vision of a bunch of men together in beating drums was more like the Proud Boys now, or some group like that.
Yeah.
They saw a bunch of guys being macho.
All right.
That's not what was going on at all. It was completely the opposite of that. It was men talking about each other, talking about their lives, bouncing off the ideas of Robert Bly, learning how to cry, coming to terms with their grief. What kind of grief do you have being a man? Not psychologically, so much with psychological processes, but through the old stories and tales and the folk tales and fairy tales and and Buddhist traditions, the Hindu mystics like Kabir and Mirabai, and Mirabai was a female, Kabir was a male. It was that kind of stuff. It was nothing.
Right.
It wasn't what was being imagined. Now the poet Sharon Dubiago, who became a friend as well later on, Ms. Magazine commissioned her, as she told me, to write a piece about it. Now, they just assumed a lot of things, and they didn't go to the source, as far as I know. And it was, we're trying to have a feminist movement, we're trying to have a women's movement, and the men are trying to take that kind of thing over, and it was that kind of thing.
Right.
Now, Sharon wrote her piece, and years later, I put Sharon on the cover of LA Weekly, and I got a call from Robert, traitor. He said, I'm not a traitor. And he cackled, and we hung up. But she wrote a piece, and she told me this when I finally met her, a wonderful poet. She told me that she had said in the piece that she respected Robert Bly and that he's a world-class poet, and etc. But she had what she had to say about the men's movement, blah, blah, blah. And she told me that Ms. cut that out.
Huh.
They didn't want anything positive about Bly.
Yeah.
And that had the effect of starting, Robert and the men's movement became a Johnny Carson show kind of joke.
Yeah.
And laughed at and derided. It went on for a while, then lost steam. James Hillman came to a few. I went to 2 or 3 other conferences. James Hillman was at one, and that's where I met James, and we had a very fruitful partnership. I put him on the cover of LA Weekly, and that was the first time he'd had a cover that was not from psychological fame, the psychology field, and that was one of the most popular interviews I ever did, and it got us a book deal, the title of which was a James Hillman line, "We've had 100 years of psychotherapy, and the world is getting worse." And it's still in print.
Is it really?
James, unfortunately. Yeah. James, unfortunately, is not.
Yeah.
And psychology magazines were not interested in doing a obit of him.
Really?
Psychotherapy Networker, which I've written for many times. The editor didn't want one, and that was the last time I wrote for them. But in any case, not to digress. And the whole thing became misjudged. What the Blind Men's Movement was, with Michael Mead, with others who collaborated with him, Joseph Campbell, sometimes before he died, was basically a middle-class, bourgeois, mostly professional in one way or another, white guys, as I say, between the ages of about 25 and 55, 25 in the United States, Finland had a female president in 1905-ish. India, Israel, England, it is kind of weird about this culture, but that aside, it was about discovering one's own maleness and and what that meant. Now, I was not that involved after the first year or so. I went to, I think, 2 more. And as I said, I met James Hillman and John Densmore. But it became my sense, and I got this from Hillman. I went up to, there was a men's conference in Santa Barbara, and I went up to Santa Barbara to see James. And I came to the conference, they asked me to speak a little, I spoke a little, and then James and I went to a bar. And James, we didn't know each other very well at the time, but he said, "You and I are very different, but we have some of the same enemies." I said, "Yeah, that doesn't surprise me." And he said, "Look, these guys are wimps." And I looked at him thinking, they're paying you pretty well, man, to be here and call them that. And I didn't know him well enough at the time to say it. Later on, we talked about it more, later in our relationship. I didn't want to screw we were having a good time talking, exchanging ideas. I didn't want to throw that into the fire just yet. But toward the end, I thought it was kind of exploitive.
Yeah.
The people going there, and
can I give a
yeah.
Can I give a little
Please.
To me, like the other day I was talking to you about the film The Swimmer, and I was talking to you about the movie Seconds, and long before that, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, and all those movies are about kind of the changing image of the Western male and how he fits into society, and they're all using men that were, the actors themselves were role models for masculinity during their heyday, and I think that during the 20th century, with the influx of this like full spectrum media of TV and movies, that in a sense the whatever you want to call it, military industrial complex big business thing had a certain image of man that they were trying to present to you, especially through westerns, to make you fight in Vietnam, to make you fight in World War II, to make you eager to be that man with conviction, a clear sense of right and wrong, and then that you get in like midway through Vietnam, they're just making money off of this war, basically drawing it out, making more and more money off of it. I mean, half of California wouldn't be there if it wasn't for that defense industry. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the defense industry. But so that image in the media begins to change of the male, right? And they do come out with movies like the Swimmer and Seconds, and then for younger males they start, this a very androgynous picture of man begins to develop in the media, and a much more unsure footing of man, that good and evil, that clear cut good and bad isn't there anymore. I think the Wild Bunch is a really good example of that. I think Peckinpah kind of got that. And so you have these men, and especially the men that would have seen that issue of the LA Weekly, or of men that grew up in California, and they're really, I mean, in California, you're getting all of that media stuff 20 years before the rest of the West, and it's like a beta version of that, and you get it much heavier, and it's much more hermetically sealed around you, and it's hard to escape. And so I definitely know the type of man that you're talking about, especially like 1 minute you need to dance like John Travolta and have that lifestyle, and then wham, that's gone. And then well, what lifestyle am I supposed to? It's almost as if they had developed a dependency on the media to tell them how to be a man.
That's very good. That's true.
But then
I felt that when I was growing up.
Sure. I mean, I think we all did. You get those cues of how to be a man. I always kind of had an ability to kind of see through that, but I was also like, most of my media intake were things that were from the 50s and 60s, like Star Trek and things like that. So I had that kind of military mindset when I was a kid, like through my grandfather and stuff. But then, so they're kind of left hanging there, and they don't have it's empty consumerism. And how to be a man is he who dies with the most toys wins idea, and who has the most money, who's got the trophy wife, and it becomes very artificial and material during that early 80s and mid 80s period, and very empty and superficial, and kind of a husk of if you are looking from that perspective, it's almost as if that wavelength of manhood is hijacked by the media, and these guys are kind of left in the confused about, because they feel empty, right? And they're doing everything right, especially these guys that would have seen that cover and everything. They're doing all the things, they're making the money, they've had the opportunities and gone and done what they were told and gone to college, and they're CPAs or they're lawyers or whatever, but they feel incredibly empty, especially if they've been doing drugs too, and those type of drugs like cocaine, and they're also left reeling from the 60s and 70s and what happened there, and did they succeed? The activist types, did they succeed with anything that they were fighting for? I mean, you see like the black community go off a cliff, whereas they were kind of like going up and up from the 40s to the 70s, and then all of a sudden, it's just like this chasm of darkness, and that they've kind of been in for the past 40 years, and that's very disappointing for people that were heavily involved in civil rights. And then you've got 2 terms of Reagan, and the military budget skyrocketing, and nukes and all that. So all of that just kind of makes for a very confusing idea of masculinity at that time. So I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. So I understand, and my idea of those Robert Bly men's conferences is like, I totally see what Hillman is talking about, and I think you did too, of course, and guys that actually had they didn't have like a tribal initiation, but they were initiated on the street, and they had to show courage on the street, and but you also you've got this group of men that were extremely pampered and extremely they kind of had a softness around their teenage lives, where they didn't get that those challenges of courage and bravery, as strange as they might be in that street world. It's still you have to walk through a slum or a tenement or a ghetto and hold your head up and keep your hands out of your pockets and look people in the eye. It takes a certain amount of bravery and an anchor, an inner anchor, that you need, and I think that is the core of it, is that solidity and that anchor in that whatever is eternal inside of you, so that you can kind of go through those things and stay solid and stay on a steady course through whatever you're going through. But I digress. But yeah, go on
really.
from them.
Not really. That's what these guys were looking for.
Yeah.
That's what they lacked. They didn't all lack it, but that's what they were looking for. And some of them, I know it did some people a lot of good. And I know that and it comes out, as I think of it, in the way the drums, the image that scared everybody of 50 men sitting together drumming, in the way the drumming was taught. John Densmore was a drummer for the Doors, and others. Marcus Wise, marvelous tabla drummer. It was taught that drumming, as it was done as a language and as a unifier of a people, of a tribe, of a village, and as a way of communication, is not just banging on a surface, and certainly not banging on a surface with anger or anything like that. You have one drum, one kind of drum, and several people playing such a drum that are laying down the foundation beat, whatever it is. That's all they do. They do it for hours. You have another drum line over that, a slightly higher tone drum that lays down another different, not so much syncopated, interweaving beat. I mean, the syncopation is right there from the beginning, but an interweaving beat. And that's all they do. And then you have another level of drum, and among those drummers, there are some lead drummers who come out with more expressive beats, but always based on this foundation. So the drum itself and the drumming becomes a model of society and rootedness when you realize that the drumming isn't going to work, and isn't going to work for the ceremonies of the tribe. Isn't going to work for a ceremony, for instance, where people can dance literally for like 20 hours. You can't do that with frenetic drumming. No way. It isn't going to last for a week of ceremony, like with often Native American drumming. You can't be frenetic about that. You can't be egocentric about that. You've got to be rooted. You've got to be part of this community. You've got to care about it. You've got to feel deeply into it. And this drumming, that primarily for us, began in Africa, and then went to the Caribbean, and then comes here as syncopation, which the way the way we know most of it now comes from the blues and from the swing drummers, Joe Jones especially, in the 30s. And what everybody, great drummer Max Roach said there are 5 beats in jazz, and Joe Jones invented 3 of them. So the drumming was the opposite of the way it was taken. It wasn't a bunch of guys in the woods going crazy with drums. It was exactly the opposite of that. It was guys trying to find rootedness in a kind of drumming that had created community in tribal lands for millennia. It had been the root of community. In many tribes, there would be a great drum that nobody drummed on. It was kind of the mother drum, the silent drum. It was the center. It was not the center, but a center of the community. These communities lasted in ecological balance for thousands of years. And part of this movement was looking to see what they could learn from that, what they could get from that. How could the drum be used in a healing kind of way in these communities of men as they came together and split apart and then went home and had men's groups at home? How could that happen? And it was completely misunderstood. That part of it was just completely misunderstood. But again, and going back to Robert Bly, once he initiated this men's conference idea, people who came to it, he didn't come up with the drumming. People who came to it came up to the drumming. He learned from them and gave them free. Oh yeah, do that. That's great. Do the drumming. Oh, that's what it means. Okay, he didn't know. In fact, and this could be a good place to end up. At that conference, because I like to run my mouth, and at that first conference, I was trying to be impressive, and after all, I've remembered Robert Bly. I wanted him to remember me, and so I'd argue points, I'd this and that, I'd talk, and kind of got a reputation that way. And we had breakfast. Breakfast was the only sort of meal they served at this conference. And I sat next to him. Because he'd been talking about American culture. He'd been talking about American music and American... he and James Hillman got American culture all wrong. They didn't get American politics wrong. But American music, jazz, rock and roll, the blues, they just did not get it.
Yeah.
and so we're sitting there having breakfast. Morning, Michael. Good morning, Robert. And I said, how are you this morning? And I said, I'm really glad you're so full of shit about rock and roll. It gives me a place to stand. And he laughed. And I wrote what became a kind of notorious essay, long essay. And I wrote specifically for my first book, Shadow Dancing in the U.S.A., which has been out of print forever now, called Hear That Long Snake Moan. Investigating the metaphysical roots of the blues and rock and roll in African and Caribbean and Celtic religions and how they mixed. And I read it's about 40 pages long. And I wrote that specifically with James Hillman and my friend Robert Bly in mind. To say, this is what I'm talking about. You're wrong that America doesn't have a metaphysics that comes up from the ground. It's not only Native American, it's also African, and it's happened this way. And it was some of my best work that wouldn't have happened, I don't think, if I hadn't been so set on teaching those
Yeah.
When he asked me to give a lecture on that at a men's conference, most of those men just sat there going, "What has this got to do with men?" and I'm playing Miles Davis tune from the 50s, a slow one. And they're saying, "What does that got to do with what we're talking about?" And I'm saying, "This is male tenderness. You want to know what it sounds like? It sounds like this." I play Louis Armstrong. This is male reverent celebration. You want to know what it sounds like? You want to feel it? Listen to it. There's something you can use in there. It went in one head and out the other, mostly.
Yeah.
But so that was to take it full circle. That's what I tried to offer these men who had taught me so much. I think why for his activism, but even more so for his poetry, made a difference, and made it in a unique way, because then, as now, most of the recognized poets are on the campuses, and that produces some good poetry. I'm not saying it doesn't, but Robert came from the school that I didn't know I was of, but that I came from too, of poetry is essentially the expression of experience, and a poet can't afford to lead a life that is sheltered from so much public experience. And that sounds like a good place to round this off.
All right. Okay.